Good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Melbourne's second MedTech webinar for 2021. My name is David Graydon, and I'm the Clifford Chair of Neural Engineering in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Melbourne. And I'm also the Director of the MedTech platform of the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology. I have the pleasure of being your MC for this webinar panel discussion today. So today we're discussing innovations in MedTech for epilepsy. I would like to start today's event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I am hosting this webinar and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. For me, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. The MedTech webinar series has been looking at the key technologies that are being developed at the University of Melbourne by our collaborators and by our close friends. So far, we've been able to see some of the key advances in brain-computer interfaces, regenerative medicine, cardiac technologies, and personalized medical devices. If you'd like to learn more about our research and innovation programs, or view any of the earlier webinars, please visit our website. Please note that this event is being recorded. The video of this webinar will be put on the university's Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology webpage. All right, so a bit about today's topic. Around 1% to 2% of the world's population have epilepsy. The Epilepsy Foundation defines epilepsy as a disease characterized by an enduring predisposition to generate epileptic seizures. Of those with epilepsy, 30% do not benefit sufficiently from medications and so continue to have seizures. This has enormous impact on their lives. This webinar will present some new advances in research and development of medical technologies that are being applied to help people with epilepsy. This includes medical devices for continuous long-term monitoring, for seizure forecasting, and for providing new treatments. We will hear from experts in the field as well as a person with epilepsy about how MedTech is providing solutions for epilepsy. Now, before I proceed with the panel discussion, I'd like to take this moment to thank you for joining us today. You're welcome to interact by typing questions for our speakers in the Q&A box to your right-hand side. Some of you have submitted questions via the registration form, but should our conversation spark further thoughts or questions, I encourage you to engage with the panel through writing new questions or liking the ones you want answered. We will try and address as many questions as possible in the hour that we have. Today, we are being joined by a graphic recorder, Zara, to help capture our thinking. She'll be creating a live visual representation of our session, which will be added to the stream every now and then so you can see its development. Hello, Zara, and thank you for joining us. All right, so to begin, I'd like to introduce you to Mari, who has epilepsy, to discuss her experience.
Hello.
Hello, Mari. Thank you very much for joining us. I know this is taking some time away from your kids at the moment, but it's really good, I think, to have a patient perspective on the experience of living with epilepsy. So could you start by please telling us about your journey with epilepsy in your life? So how did it start? How was it first diagnosed?
I first started having strange sensations when I was 17, so in high school. And then it changed when I went on my gap year. I was traveling overseas for 9 months, and I started having what I called mind blanks. So I didn't perceive them as a medical condition. But a few months into my trip, my parents cottoned on. I was chatting to my mum on the phone, and all of a sudden I said, "What country am I in?" And she freaked out about that. But I really wanted to keep traveling. So my parents looked around for a medical opinion that suited that. So it wasn't a neurologist they spoke to said I should come home straight away, but they found a medical physician who said if we kept monitoring the situation, I could travel for a bit longer. But about 6 weeks later, it got to a point where they were just getting worse and worse and more frequent. And so I had an EEG where I was at the time, which was Pushkar in India. Flew home and was diagnosed in Perth, which is where I lived at the time, grew up in Perth. but decided to move to Melbourne a few weeks later to study at RMIT, and was referred to Mark Cook, who's looked after me for about 13 years now.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So how does epilepsy impact on your life and on your family and friends?
For the first 9 months, it had a big impact while we were trying to find a medication which controlled my seizures. So it was difficult because I just moved to Melbourne and I had no friends or family. And my memory was really bad. So I'd call my mum up every morning and ask her how to get to the train station. And she had to come over and stay with me for a couple of months. And I've forgotten pretty much my whole first year of living in Melbourne. But we managed to find a combination of meds that worked really well and controlled my seizures well for probably 11 years or 9. But it's become a problem again. It turns out pregnancy, breastfeeding, sleepless nights, being a mum is a big seizure trigger. So it's become, a problem again. The biggest impact is just the effects of the seizures. So I feel really exhausted afterwards, which makes being a mum even trickier. Also just problems with memory. I'll be speaking to someone and I'll, have forgotten a conversation we had recently, which can be just a bit embarrassing. And then there's just an extra layer of stress, because stress itself is a seizure trigger. During stressful periods like last year, lockdown and everything that happened, it just means there's that extra level of stress because I'm worried that the stress I'm experiencing is going to cause more seizures, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So how have you found the various treatments for epilepsy? Often it's difficult to find what's the best treatment. And do the treatments themselves impact on you, do you think?
My epilepsy's been treated with medications, and we've tried a few. Initially, there were pretty significant side effects. So that's part of why my first 9 months in Melbourne were so tricky, as I wasn't just experiencing the uncontrolled seizures, it was also the effects of the medication, which made me really flat and tired. And I mean, it's kind of hard to know what was the seizures and what was the drugs. But while they were controlling my seizures well, it wasn't a problem. So the treatments worked really well while they were working for those 9 years. But we're in the process of starting a new drug. I took it for the first time last night, so we'll see. Yeah.
Well, hope for the best there.
Yeah.
So what do you see as, I mean, you've touched on this already, but what do you see as being the biggest problems with managing your condition?
The biggest problems is just how difficult it makes being a mum when I'm having seizures. So it's already an exhausting job, and I'm an optimistic person. Like, that's my natural way of being, is sort of optimistic and happy, but I just find it's a little bit, it just tips me over. Like, it's just when I have a seizure, it just makes me feel really kind of gross and wiped out. And then you've got, this might be at 9 a.m. in the morning, and I've got a whole day ahead of me of looking after, an 11-month-old and a 3.5-year-old, and it's just can just be overwhelming. I'm still breastfeeding a lot and not sleeping well, so it can just. There's just been moments of despair this year where I've just been like, I don't actually know how I'm going to do it. We've been upping my meds sort of in increments, and it would sort of work for a little while, but then they just bubble up again, which is why we're going to try something new. So that's the biggest problem, is just, the breakthrough seizures since having this big life change of being a mum.
And how one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is the different technologies that are available for epilepsy. How do you feel about that? Would you be happy to try different technologies that might help?
I would, yes. I've spoken to Mark about this, because it sounds like there might be the possibility for, predicting seizures, which would be amazing. Yeah, really good, because the unpredictability of it can be what's stressful. And, not just for me, for my family as well, because it's all interconnected. Yeah. And they tend to snowball. So if I have one, I'm more likely to have another. Actually, I didn't mention also during the pregnancies, it was a problem. Like both of my pregnancies ended in an induction because I guess they just got worried about, wanting a healthy baby, healthy mum. And because I was still having seizures at the end there, meant that I had to be induced both times, which, isn't the end of the world. But yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mari, for sharing your personal insights into this discussion. I think that
no worries.
We really appreciate your time this afternoon for this, and I think it'll really help people to who are attending to understand the background to some of these technologies we're going to be talking about, because they do impact on people, and I think people really do need them as well. So I really, really appreciate you coming on. I understand that you're going to have to go off now and look after your kids. But hopefully feel free, of course, to watch the rest of the webinar and see what questions come up. But thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
All right. That was really wonderful. So I would now like to introduce our expert panel and invite them, first of all, to give a presentation about their experience and knowledge in the technology for this disease. And so first up is John Heisman. Dr. John Heisman is the COO of Epiminder. Epiminder is an Australian venture that was launched in July 2018 to develop and commercialize a device called Minder, an ultra-long-term implantable EEG monitoring system for use in the management of epilepsy. John has over 20 years of experience in medical devices and provides specialist expertise, operations management, and leadership for the local and global activities of this new company, Epiminder. Prior to joining Epiminder, John was a senior manager at Cochlear Limited, working across a variety of R&D efforts that included surgical diagnostics, remote care, signal processing, and device diagnostics, primarily in the hearing area. John started his career in medical devices through the completion of a PhD that investigated the use of brain control interfaces for use with upper limb neuroprostheses. So great to have you here with us today, John. Over to you.
Thanks, David, and thank you for extending the introduction and also the chance to talk today. So my insight today into epilepsy is really to reflect a little bit about what Epiminder, the company, has done and is doing presently in this space. And what you can see here is just a slide that illustrates some of the key components of the device that David referred to, which is an ultra long-term implantable EEG monitoring device. And the mission for Epiminder really is to address the significant unmet clinical need in the area of epilepsy, whereby it is very difficult to make either a diagnosis or an ongoing prognosis of the condition of epilepsy, particularly in adults, where currently the use of monitoring of the brainwaves or the EEG is conducted either in the clinic or in an ambulatory fashion in the patient's own home. And that provides only a very small time window to observe the activity of the brain, and doesn't really provide a long-term profile of what's going on in adults with diagnosed epilepsy. So our mission is to come up with a long-term monitoring implant. And you can see here there's a picture of a lady where there's an electrode that is running up from an implanted device that is going across the slightly posterior to the midline of the head, ipsilateral to contralateral, and it provides a means of capturing the EEG on a 24/7 basis, because it can communicate with an external wearable, and which is positioned behind the ear. And that wearable has also a Bluetooth connection to a mobile phone, which in turn can stream that EEG data up to the cloud in real time, such that the physician can then interrogate that data in the future with the assistance of algorithms, computer-assisted reviewing. And you'll be hearing from Dr. Caroli around potentially how that data, that long-term data, might also be used for predicting or forecasting when these epileptic or seizure events may be occurring for each patient. Our initial interest is really to take this device, this implanted device with those components you can see here, into a clinical study in Australia, which we're currently doing. We have 9 patients currently implanted, and we'd like to extend that out to probably 50 over the next 2 years to gather enough evidence to allow future algorithms to be developed, and also for us to seek regulatory approval for this device for sale in the US specifically. And so we're looking at potentially getting registration of this device sometime in early 2023 in the US. I might leave it there, David.
Hey, well, thank you very much, John. I think that's a great way to kick us off with some really impressive technology, and I think it's great to see that this technology is going to be used in so many people so soon as well, which could be of benefit to them along the way. All right, so next we have Pip Caroli. So Dr. Philippa Caroli is working to develop an innovative patient-specific approach to seizure forecasting. Using sophisticated computational techniques, she's using long-term data from brain recordings and environmental, behavioral, and physiological factors to develop useful seizure likelihood models. For 3 years, Pip also worked as a software engineer for the Australian medical technology company SEER. At SEER, she developed a mobile app that provides people with epilepsy insight into their seizure patterns. Now her research combines this app data with wearable devices and neural implants to generate real-time insights into seizure likelihood. To achieve this goal, Pip maintains close ties with industry partners, providing the optimal balance to translate medical research into innovative clinical solutions. Welcome, Pip. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thanks, David, and thanks for the introduction. Am I slide? Yes, here are the slides. Okay, so I guess I don't really need to start on my career background because David gave a pretty nice overview, but I thought I would start with the photo of David as he was the host anyway. So my PhD research now has been very much focused on this phenomenon that we call seizure cycles, which is where people's epileptic activity and their seizures follow these really interesting and not very well understood long-term patterns. So we see weekly cycles, we see monthly cycles. It's very individual, and we think we can use these cycles to help forecast periods of high risk. Next slide. So this is just an example of one individual's seizures. They're shown there in the red over a period of several weeks, and you can see that they're happening with this regular, repeating pattern, and that's just highlighted by the red bars, which show when they might be in high-risk stages. Next slide. And so with my software development work at SEER, what we were really aiming to create was a whole suite of mobile and wearable monitoring devices that could be used to develop a personalized seizure gauge that would give people with epilepsy more control over their day-to-day activities and just restore some of that predictability and help manage the uncertainty. So we've started testing this out in our research, and this has been published. So this is an example of how it works for 2 different individuals from one of our recent publications. So this is just tracking people's cycles over about a 30-day period. You can see there on the vertical axis, and we're giving them times when they're in low risk and high risk. That's shown in green and red. You can see these interesting cycles over the course of a day along the horizontal axis, but also how those cycles change over much longer time periods, so sort of weekly cycles and monthly cycles. And the main message here is that most of their seizures, the black dots there, are occurring in high risk. And these forecasts were simply derived from the people's reported event time. So we can track the cycle just from the times, the historical times that we're seeing their events occur. Next slide. However, we think we can do a lot better with tracking these cycles using devices such as John was talking about, and even using wearable monitors. So we're running a study using a Fitbit smartwatch to track wearable sensors from heart rate, from respiratory rate, from sleep. All of these things are known to trigger seizures for different individuals. And just, you know, a very, very high level, but on the picture there on the right, you can see a sensor from someone's heart rate, one individual person. Over about 6 month period, we can see quite clearly there is this cycle in their heart rate. We're not sure yet what causes these longer rhythms, but it definitely might be related to stress and sleep and these sorts of things that Mari was talking about. It's very individual. Again, this person happens to have a 7-day cycle and a 32-day cycle, but we see all different rhythms for different people. And these rhythms, again, can be related back to someone's risk of having seizures. So next slide. And just to wrap up, we would like to be able to combine all these different measures, these different cycles and other individual risk factors into just one overall app that integrates a lot of this data and ultimately gives someone a measure of a forecast of their seizure likelihood. It would work something like a weather app that people are quite familiar with in their phones, but it's that combination of lots of data sources that I think really makes it quite powerful. So I mentioned the mobile and wearable devices, but we're also looking at long-term recordings of brain activity from EEG. So this device there in the center is the Seizure. That's a wearable sort of short-term EEG monitor. That's Mark there holding an early prototype of the EpiMinder device. You'll see in a minute that's obviously Mark in his pre-lockdown with his pre-lockdown look before he grew a beard. And from a scientific perspective in my research, we're also really interested in looking at some of the wearable metabolic sensors that are coming into the MedTech space to really actually understand the causes of these multi-day cycles a little bit better. And I think that's all from me. Yeah, and of course, yeah, there's a large team to acknowledge when it comes to all of this research and forecasting development.
Well, thank you very much, Pip. So now I would like to introduce this person who's been referred to by all three of our speakers so far, Mark Cook. So Professor Mark Cook is Director of the Graeme Clark Institute and the Sir John Eccles Chair of Medicine and Director of Clinical Neurosciences at St Vincent's Hospital. He's recognised internationally for his expertise in epilepsy management, particularly imaging and surgical planning. After completing specialist training in Melbourne, he undertook an MD thesis while working as a brain research fellow at Queen Square, London. Then he returned to St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, to continue his interest in management of complex epilepsy. He's worked closely with engineers, including myself, for most of his career, developing novel therapies for epilepsy. His interests include experimental models of epilepsy and seizure prediction, and he has led the commercialization of the implantable seizure detection device that is being commercialized by EpiMinder. Welcome, Mark. I'll hand over to you now for your presentation.
Thanks very much, David. Now, I'm going to speak about something a little bit different from the others in that this is a specific treatment for epilepsy. One of the problems, as you heard early on, is that the treatments for epilepsy aren't always completely effective, and there's problems taking medications regularly, and there are lots of issues around the way we treat the condition at the moment, quite apart from the problems we have monitoring how well we're treating it. We were interested to see if it was possible to provide drugs to treat epilepsy in a very different way, and that was directly to the brain. Now, normally when you ingest drugs for epilepsy, they pass through the liver and get metabolized, and that can reduce the amount that is available to get to the brain, but also it might produce side effects in the rest of the body where we don't actually want the drug to be effective particularly. So being able to put drug directly in the brain was very interesting as a possibility, but very difficult to do. We experimented for a while in using polymer implants, which slowly leached drug out into the brain or the tissues around it. But then we moved to a study in concert with a company called Cerebral Therapeutics based out of Colorado, where they had a pump-based system that we could use to deliver drug directly to brain. And you can see here the components of the system. So there's a pump which is implanted under the skin of the abdomen. These sorts of pumps are used a bit in other circumstances, so they're often used to treat spinal conditions such as pain and spasticity, in which case the catheter going out of the pump goes around to the spine. You can see here, though, the catheter is running up under the skin of the chest and neck, and we implant a catheter into the brain, into the fluid-filled cavities that are in the centre of the brain called the ventricles. Now, the technology around putting catheters into the brain is very well established, but usually we're draining fluid out of the brain. So we use it for conditions where there's obstruction to the fluid flow. But in this condition, we were going to be delivering drug back through one of these catheters. We were also interested to be able to take samples of the fluid in the brain to find out how much of the drug was there. And that's the Ommaya that's mentioned there. So the Ommaya reservoir lets us put a needle in the external part of the device going into the brain there and extract some fluid to measure the level of drug in there. And that was obviously very important to us early on when this was very experimental. Here you can see how those catheters end up. So you can see there's a device which is implanted under the skin that's joined to the pump via the catheter running under the skin. And you can see the two catheters running into the brain, one to deliver the drug and the other to take samples of fluid out. And we can do that just by passing a needle through the skin of the scalp into that blue device you can see on top of the skull there, and we can extract some of the fluid to measure. So we started doing this for people with very serious epilepsy that hadn't been controlled by other medications, very significant problem for about a third of people with epilepsy, unfortunately. And we were able to show that delivering the drug in this way was very effective. And we used a drug which has been around for a very long time and had been tried by all of the patients in the study as a tablet but hadn't worked. But here, given directly to the brain through this catheter-based system, we saw spectacular results with patients getting good and consistent relief from their seizures now over periods of several years. So I guess the point of showing this is we had quite a unique engineering solution to a problem which had otherwise resisted all other kinds of treatment and one which is very common in people with epilepsy. So it was a great study, which is still ongoing. We've just started a new phase of the study, recruiting another 50 or 60 patients, and it is moving internationally. So there will be trial centres now in Israel, the United States, and other parts of Australia. So thanks very much for listening to me.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Now, I think what we'll do is to bring all of our panelists on, and we'll delve a bit deeper into the topic, answer some of the questions that have been raised. Some questions were raised during registrations, so we'll probably start with them as we wait for some questions to come through from the audience. But perhaps, John, could I start with you? What are some of the biggest challenges facing early stage medical startups, MedTech startups in Australia?
Thanks, David. It's a great question, and certainly something that is probably front of mind of a lot of early stage companies who are looking to work in this space. In particular, anything that's really implanted in the body is certainly a challenge to get moving, because I think this is a bit at the valley of death in many ways, is that people have some great ideas, but actually translating that into something that can be utilized in a clinical study really requires a manufacturer of implantable devices, or an institute that can make those devices. And in Australia, there really isn't many choices. Epimind is very fortunate in that we have a very close relationship with Cochlear, who's a commercial collaborator, and that we've been able to leverage a lot of their existing technology and also manufacturing to produce those devices that we're currently implanting in patients in in Mark's clinic. It's at Vincent's. And I think, Mark, the genesis of the Minder implant goes right back many, many years ago with Mark and his team investigating the various ways of designing such a system. And I think it's sort of certainly come to fruition in recent years such that we can actually start running these studies.
Perhaps I could actually segue then to Mark and ask you, what were those things that you saw about epilepsy and about the need that led to thinking of the development of a device like the Minder?
Well, I guess it was really the experience of seeing a lot of people with epilepsy and understanding that it was the unpredictability of the condition that was the chief problem. And as you know, our first project around this started with studying whether we could predict epileptic seizures. Now, getting on for 20 years ago, and it's taken a long time to get there. But I guess I was most struck by my own experience. So, my dad had epilepsy, and he was very embarrassed by his seizures, and that made him very isolated. So he was apprehensive about going out and seeing other people. He was ashamed of them, really, and it always was something which I thought if we could tell people when they were having seizures, it would just change their lives so much. And I could see the only way to do that was having an implantable device. Plus a bit of smart around analysing it.
Yeah. Well, so that leads us then to Pip. Pip, what are the main challenges to overcome before we see forecasting systems actually publicly available and used?
Yeah, well, I think with the earlier trial that Mark spoke about it and the technological advances we've made since then in understanding the risk factors and the cycles, I think we're there from a technical perspective. And I think we're able to launch systems, especially now that we have devices going into patients, the Minder device coming out, and we're seeing from preliminary results that the forecasts are accurate and they work. So I think the challenge we have now is a UX, a user experience challenge, where we actually need to work very closely with the users, the people with epilepsy, and understand how we deliver the forecasts in a way that that will work for them in their day-to-day, that they'll actually use and keep using. Retention is a problem often. They have to, there is some burden on them to keep charging the device and keeping everything coming through. And as well for the doctors, how we can make forecasts most useful for them, how we can integrate it with their clinical practice so that they can use it to inform treatment changes and that sort of thing.
So this is an interesting question that's come through, and it's about, to show that a MedTech product has got the accuracy that you need, you obviously need a large data set, and you need to really be able to show it. So perhaps, John, if I could put to you first, how much data will you need to collect in the sort of early trials of the Minder device to be able to demonstrate that it is effective enough to go to market?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and you can never have enough data, I think, is the answer. So, but from a company's point of view, one of the key stakeholders to appease and to make sure that you're satisfying all the necessary regulatory requirements is the FDA, for example, for us, or if you're going to Europe, it's the the MDR. So look, I think it's a challenging question because the use of these sophisticated algorithms like machine learning and artificial intelligence is not only in recent years becoming more accepted by the FDA, and there aren't that many commercial products making use of these in the US at the moment. So I think it's an open question. But to try and answer the bit that I can answer is I think as looking after an R&D program, you really need to have a good representation of the patient population you're implanting. So there are different types of pathologies for epilepsy that it's important that you cover those. So therefore you have it's not just about the data, but it's about the number of patients you implant and the types of patients.
Yeah. How about you, Pip? You know, to do accurate seizure forecasting, how much data do you need?
Again, I mean, as John said, how long is a piece of string? I think one of the interesting things where this problem differs from potentially other medical sort of machine learning problems is that what we really look for is longitudinal data in an individual. So everyone's seizures, everyone's risk factors are quite different. And the algorithm that forecasts very well in one person will not just translate out of the box to another. When we talk about big data, what we really mean is having large numbers of seizures and long-term, months to years recording in a single individual to validate that their forecasts are accurate, rather than just having a very high N in your cohort of people. Although that is also important to understand that our results can generalize. But I think we understand quite well that the cycles sort of appear they're very prevalent across people with epilepsy, and it's a matter of validating that now, the accuracy in an individual level.
Mark, Mari mentioned it towards the end of her interview that she as a person with epilepsy is very interested in technologies that may be able to help her. So do you think that generally people with epilepsy are willing to try out these new approaches?
Absolutely, no question. I mean, a few years ago when we had this Neurovista study, which was a very invasive device, completely experimental, and we had no idea at the time whether we could predict seizures with it. But we started that trial and invited patients to participate. We had no difficulty getting patients involved. Patients are really, really interested to help us understand how these things might work. And they're really, really interested in participating in trials of this kind, even if it's completely uncertain as to whether it might help them in any way. So I guess it's an important thing to remember. Often you get the impression that these things are pressed on reluctant patients, but reluctance is really not part of the equation normally. People just want to help, and they love being involved in applications of technology like this.
Well, Mark, perhaps I could follow up then with a question that's come from the audience, which is, do you think devices like the UNEEG device that's being developed as well, that are in the market in Europe, could open the way, like Minder as well, to better understanding epilepsy or better treating?
Yeah, I'm sure the UNEEG device is similar to ours, but it's on one side of the brain only, which we see as something of a disadvantage. But yes, I mean, there'll be more of these devices, no doubt, that will become available to help continuously record EEG activity. Clearly ours is superior, but that might just be my view.
Yeah. Okay, we also have a question here from Shreyazi, who asks, what are the open research problems relating to the use of wearable sensors, such as not just EEG sensors, but also movement sensors and so on for this problem? Perhaps I could direct that to you, Pip, first.
Yeah, so there's, I mean, we're really in the early stages of using wearable sensors to understand seizures and epilepsy. And so just being able to use them to detect seizures is quite a difficult and open problem. In my own research, I'm very interested to see which other sensors have utility in tracking these cycles, and that will help us understand the causes of cycles a lot better. But I just, I think that there's a lot of really open questions. One of the, I guess, important factors is that we really need a good sort of gold standard record of when people are having seizures along with the wearable sensor data, and that is hard to come by. So that's where you need a device that's sort of implanted in the head long term, like the Minder device, so that we understand, as well as having the wearables, we understand exactly when seizures are occurring in conjunction with the multimodal data.
Yeah, so do you think then that apart from collecting a whole lot of data from many patients to set things up, that over time a device can be specifically tuned to an individual patient as you get more and more data from them? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here about EpiMinder, so perhaps I'll direct it to you, John. I think it is looking at adapting for seizure prediction. I suppose one of the things that's being asked there that is assuming that maybe 90% accurate is what we're after. But what do you think in terms of how well does the device have to perform in order for it to be useful? In one sense for monitoring, because we do know it's not using very many electrodes. So how well does it need to perform? And also, what do you think about what needs to be the level of performance for something like seizure forecasting?
Sure. Well, I think there's two components to that question. And the second component around forecasting, I might hand it across to Pip. But just in terms of the performance we're striving for with Professor Cook around detecting seizures, because of course we have a subset of the number of electrodes that are typically used for EEG monitoring in a clinic or in ambulatory settings. And what we're really trying to do is not diagnose epilepsy or spatially locate where the seizures are originating from or moving to, but rather just to count seizures in its more simplistic way and profile those over time. So those epileptic events may be short, medium, and long. And what we'd like to do is build up a profile of those events over time. And what we're observing in terms of your question around, how sensitive do we need to be to, existing systems? Well, we're actually, for the 9 patients we've implanted with, correlating really well to the, it's a bit counterintuitive, but those subscalp electrodes are picking up every event that we're picking up with 20 electrodes with the 1020 system, which is the gold standard. So I think by having it underneath the scalp, you have a significant advantage in terms of the signal-to-noise ratio, and it seems to pick up, both seizures happening centrally, frontal, and anterior. On the predictability, I might just handball that across to Pip.
Well, actually, I was thinking of directing that first to Mark. It'd be good to get a clinician's perspective on how well does a device have to perform to be useful.
I think that depends on the patient. So with the earlier study, we found what was most useful for patients was having the device tell them when they weren't going to have a seizure. So knowing when you're safe is actually more use than anything else. So being able to do that accurately is very, very important. I think it's impossible to know for sure, because obviously these haven't been deployed in the field to the extent necessary to test it. But I suspect it will vary person to person, and that some people will be more keen to have as much time in predicted seizure-free state as they can, whereas others will be more interested to know if there is any risk of seizures. So I think there'll be a balance, and I suspect the algorithms and the way the information is represented will need to be very carefully balanced for people to find what suits them best. Of course, it'll depend on their activities too, because if you're driving, you need to know there's going to be no seizures. And again, with various occupations, the certainty of no seizures will be at a premium. For others, that will be less critical.
Yeah. So perhaps then I could then now come to you, Pip, and say, what is the level of performance that's possible with seizure forecasting now?
Well, again, we can't answer that properly until we run a prospective trial. And there has only ever been one prospective trial in seizure forecasting in epilepsy, and that was Mark's trial that he alluded to earlier, that used quite an invasive implant. So as to what we can achieve, I mean, we've seen some preliminary results looking at from the wearables and from Minder's device, but yeah, the answer is to watch this space, because we just need to run it prospectively to get a proper answer.
Perhaps I'll actually move on to another question that we've had, which is quite an interesting one. So if you consider the relative predictiveness of alternative inputs like smartwatches and heart monitors and so on compared to EEG, how much do you think that these sources might reduce the need for an implantable device?
Well, again, I mean, we're in the sort of early stages of starting to run a prospective trial of the wearables. And I think, as I mentioned before, it's really important to have the brain recordings so that we get an accurate and reliable record of seizures. And that's really the only way we can work out how predictive they are. Once we have that data, if we can see that the forecast base from wearables do correspond very well to people's electrographic, their EEG seizure risk, then maybe we can move forward to offering wearable systems to some people who, and for whatever reason, an implant, even a minimally invasive implant, is not appealing or not suitable.
Yeah.
But there's still quite a lot of science to be done before we have that answer. And I think there are also applications for forecasts where the accuracy there's a lower bar, so we're not going to tell someone to go out and drive, but maybe we can use it to titrate their treatment a little bit smarter. So for instance, like with Mark's drug pump, we can use less drugs at times when they're at lower risk, and that would quite importantly extend the lifespan of the pump.
Actually, this leads very well onto the next question, which I'll direct to Mark. So how would you best manage epilepsy when you have these devices? Given that you might have a device that's warning of an impending seizure, or the other way around, saying that a seizure is unlikely, how would that affect your treatment?
So I think one problem at the moment is that we give treatments that act all of the time for epilepsy, because we're not sure when seizures are going to occur, so it's necessary to give patients a drug which will cover them constantly. But that brings with it the side effects constantly too, so that's a big issue. The question's really asking, I guess, could we give drugs just when we needed to? And that would be fantastic. And at the moment, there are very few drugs which have been designed to work in that way, because they've all been based on the principle of providing continuous cover. So we have only a small number of drugs, all from one class really, the benzodiazepines, which can be used to provide rapid treatment of seizures given orally or via other means. And you might be able to get drugs like that you took only when a seizure was at high risk or imminent. That would be perfect. Well, it wouldn't be perfect, but it'd be better than what we've got. I guess the other opportunity is that we could use these systems to, in some way, control other therapies. So you can see straight away how with a pump-based system, you might arrange delivery of the drug only when required, as Pip mentioned. So at times of high risk, you could actually deliver the drug from the pump then. That would have a huge impact, because at the moment we have to fill up the pump every month with the drug. And if you could even halve the time of release, obviously that has a spectacular effect on not only the inconvenience to the patient, but the cost and so on. So it would be really, really important to be able to do that. There are other therapies too, the electrical stimulation therapies of the brain too, which could be controlled by similar means. And again, this would have significant implications for battery life, minimising side effects and so on. So I think our ability to forecast them even approximately is going to have a very big impact down the track on how we deliver our therapies. The therapeutic world, though, needs to catch up with that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. John, can I come back to you with the next question? And this is just about the minder itself and how it's implanted. Does it need general anesthesia to be implanted? How invasive is the surgery? What classifies as being able to call an implanted device minimally invasive?
It's certainly it's a good question, and indeed. So just to provide some more context around the minder device, is that it's not an intracranial electrode design, but rather it is an electrode that is a lead that's placed underneath the skull, so above the skull, underneath the skull, and then that lead is then attached to something that looks very much like a cochlear implant, the implant chassis and an inductive coil. And that procedure currently for the study that's being run at St Vincent's is being done under general anaesthesia. But we are investigating whether there would be, I think the term appetite from the surgeon and the patient as to whether that could be done under local anaesthetic. And it's certainly not a near-term prospect, but something that in the years ahead I think could become more tangible, particularly with improved surgical tooling and better insights into the technique we're using at the moment. So I think there's a big yes on that question.
Okay, thanks, John. Back to you, Mark, with a question from Stefan Major.
Mhm.
What are the hurdles for making a long-term drug delivery device? Obviously, this needs to be in the body for a very long time. So what's the challenges of the really long-term use?
Well, the challenge is setting aside issues around understanding how the drugs work and their side effects and so on, which are obviously big challenges because they've not been delivered in this way. So we don't know what effects they might have on the brain long-term delivered in these sorts of concentrations. So that's a big issue. But I suspect you're asking more about the engineering side of it. And as far as the catheter goes and the implantation process, I mean, those devices have been put in for many years, as I mentioned, to drain fluid, and they last a very long time. They can get blocked and other problems can occur with them, but generally they're pretty stable systems. The pump's another matter. They've been used for a long time to deliver agents for other conditions into the spine, like I said, but using them for the brain and pumping upstream like this is something that they haven't been specifically designed to do, although their technical features would suggest they can do it in the long term. Pump failures and ensuring that the pumps are compatible with the drug that you're delivering. I think these are, really new areas of study because no one's looked at a lot of these different agents over long periods of time, and we've still got a lot to learn about that. How the different concentrations affect the viscosity of the drugs that we're putting in there and other excipients that are provided with those agents, and their possible effects on the catheters or the pump themselves. Huge problems. So much to be learned.
Yeah, so I might follow on with that then and ask each of you, well, John and Pip, because Mark's already tapped into this, which is, what do you think are some of the real interesting scientific or engineering questions that we are wanting to answer or tackle right now? Perhaps if I could start with you, Pip, and you could tell us a bit about the research fellowship that you have now with the NHMRC.
Yeah, so I mean, the fellowship project that I have is it's more translational, really. It's about forecasting, using these cycles of seizure risk to develop and incorporate more data streams into forecasts. But the question that really keeps me up at night as a scientist is, why do these longer rhythms exist at all in people? Like, what is driving this? Does it matter for other conditions other than epilepsy? I suspect probably yes. And what sort of devices can we use to understand the mechanisms a little bit more? So, can we now, for very long periods, can we measure heart rate, other metabolites that are circulating in the body in a way that's tractable for long-term monitoring, so months and years, to understand really what's going on there.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Pip. John, do you have any thoughts as well on what do you see as interesting, important steps?
Yeah, look, we're very interested in understanding what we're measuring chronically in the brain signal. So, other than the Neurovista study that Professor Cook was driving, there is a sort of not much data to work on in terms of, what the profiles of these events look like over time, which is obviously a key input to, forecasting and prediction models, but also how those little events in the brain waves correspond to changes in drugs, someone taking a new drug, the efficacy of the drugs, whether we can use biomarkers in the EEG to help assess how well the drug treatment's going. So a much more objective, and also what sort of information we present to the physician in a way that is accessible to them for each patient and how they can action that. So there's a lot to learn here, and we're really only at sort of the first stage of this in collecting safety and some initial data, but there's a long journey ahead of us.
Yeah, actually, John, this does also raise an interesting question. Could you tell us because you are doing research as well as looking to prove a product, and so could you describe the difference between research activities and product development and how this balance is maintained in an early stage startup?
Yeah, look, it is certainly a balancing act, because as a company you need to have a pretty laser sharp focus on getting enough evidence through clinical testing and also bench testing that you can seek regulatory approval from the necessary bodies that you're trying to get approval from. But at the same time, you want to keep evolving the product, and to do that, you need to have an R&D group. And typically, at least in EpiMinder, we have the majority of people who are inside the company are more product focused. But then we have some wonderful collaborative partners like CE Medical, University of Melbourne, and St Vincent's, and others, and Eccles Institute, that allows us to really keep working on the research in a much more of an open environment that's less controlled. But then we also can focus on the product side of things and bring things in. So I think it's a balance you need to maintain throughout your life cycle of the product.
Yeah, and Mark, how about you? How do you find balancing doing research, development, and clinical work all at the same time?
Well, I think it's critical. I mean, the clinical work for me is essential because you need to be able to provide the insights to the science and the needs around the hardware and patient utility. That part's essential. It's obviously equally critical to have research as an important ongoing component of any commercial activity. I mean, every successful device has relied very much on continued improvements. And I guess Cochlear is a good example of this. So you've got to keep improving things, the technology changes, and if you're going to keep ahead of the market and obviously provide the best possible outcomes to patients, research is essential.
Well, thank you. And well, on behalf of the MedTech platform and the University of Melbourne, I'd like to thank our panel for their contributions to this discussion. I found it very interesting. So thanks again, Mark, Pip, and John, and also Mari, if you're listening. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Also like to thank our audience for all the really interesting questions and the interest in this important issue. We would appreciate your input on our post-event survey, which will be located at the bottom of this video stream and in the Q&A chat box. We value your feedback to help us shape the future of our MedTech webinar series. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a nice day.